Let me start by introducing myself. My name is Avan Mathur. I'm a product manager at ElectricFlow. And until recently, I was actually out in the field working on site with many of our large customers and helping them approach problems like this, planning for huge scale, designing your pipelines for scalability and resiliency. So I have some experience working with some of our very large customers. And I will bring some of that here today to share with you a lot of the lessons we've learned and a lot of the best practices that we try to bring into these situations. So before we get into it, what do I really mean by scale? What is huge? And earlier this year, I was working very closely with a very large customer of ours that is a Fortune 5 bank. And for them, scale is deploying to 140,000 targets. So that is big, right? It might be bigger than some people think about, but definitely it was something where we had to really think about it before we started approaching the problem. It's not 10 applications, it's actually 6,000 applications that are planned to be onboarded at an accelerated pace over the next couple of years. So it's not taking a single problem and solving it, but taking a very large problem, breaking it down, and making a generic solution that can be used across the entire organization. I've also worked very closely with one of our large customers that is a chip manufacturer, and their workload is different. They're doing kind of CI build type of workloads, but it's still looking at large scale. They're running over 100,000 jobs through our system each day. They have a constant load on the system, and they have very high job throughput. So it's, there's a constant load of these 100K jobs that are broken, throughout the day, constantly putting load on the system. One thing that when we were working with them to improve performance that was very important to them, they were focused in specifically on between when I run my script or click launch, between that time and when the job starts, that is critical to us. That's not something that everyone thinks about, but when you're at this large scale, every small slice of time counts. And so these are things that you have to start thinking about as you start growing to these larger scales. So for you and for anyone as they're starting down this path, it's important to plan ahead. Understand what your end goal is. So I've worked with customers who started small, maybe with a few applications or a few projects coming onto CI, and they don't realize what, after 3-4 years, after 3-4 months, what this is going to look like. It might grow beyond those single applications or few projects as they get success, as it gets traction across the organization. It can grow into hundreds of projects, and then suddenly you're not ready to handle it. So having that vision, having that goal in mind, what does our ultimate scale look like, is really important to making your plan. So you want to estimate and plan for your goal, and what does that mean to you? Beyond that, what is your success criteria? You want all of these applications running, but what does it mean to succeed? How many deployments do you have that you want to complete per deployment window? What is the max duration of a deployment? I was talking about that bank. They have a 2-hour window in which they have downtime to run all of their deployments. So it's very important that all of the deployments for their 6,000 applications run in that amount of time. So the duration, the number of concurrent deployments that have to be able to run at once is very important. And then alongside that comes benchmarking. You want to validate your numbers with benchmarks. So you can't just assume it will work. You want to make sure it will work. So you want to test with real workloads in real environments. So part of that is deciding what metrics you want to measure. So these are just a few sample metrics that you might want to measure as part of these benchmarks. So CI cycle time is not only your build time. This includes check-in, build, the tests that you're running. A few other ones here, I talked about deployment frequency and duration, understanding, how frequently are you going to be running deployments? How long will they take? Is deployment lead time important to you? This should be something that is, repeatable, stable. and then mean time to recovery is something that in itself encompasses a number of other measurable pieces. How long does it take to discover the problem? How long does it take to communicate, resolve, and get that fix out there? And then release frequency and release predictability. So these are just some things, but you have to choose the metrics that matter to you and your business. So now that we've kind of talked about what do I mean by scale, what do you need to do to start thinking about scale? Now let me talk about the areas that I'll be focusing on. So infrastructure, and then looking at the data that is generated from your processes, how you want to manage that, how you want to make sure you're staying ahead of that data. Your pipeline design itself, how you want to design your pipeline for scale, and then monitoring, having that feedback loop after you've gotten to that point. So starting with infrastructure, you want to make your system robust and scalable. So you would want to have a clustered environment where you can provide high availability and that horizontal scaling to scale out your environment further as required. So in the cluster, if one server goes down, the others will continue to process the load. So that gives you that high availability. Beyond that, you want to set up a DR site as well, because if your whole site goes down, if there's a disaster, having another site available to switch over to that where everything is being replicated. And then for the horizontal scaling, as you go beyond the capacity of your current cluster, what are you going to do? What is your next step? You want to have the ability to maybe add a server to your cluster and increase the capacity of your current system. So as part of that, you want to understand what does it mean when I add a node to my cluster? What is the improvement? What is the increased capacity? It's not generally going to be linear, so you want to have that idea in mind so you can plan to see what is the extended capacity of my current cluster. Am I going to need to, add additional clusters? You may have the option of combining different services or components of your infrastructure onto single servers. So you might be able to put like an orchestration, web, repository, or file system all in one system. But of course, it's generally recommended to distribute these components to improve performance. So as you're designing your infrastructure, you want to separate these out and have each piece of hardware optimized for the specific workload that you have running on it. So while your artifact repository might be more I/O heavy, you want to make sure your orchestration server has the CPU and memory required for the load that's being put on it. It's also important to choose your database that provides the reliability through clustering as needed, that it is sized appropriately. I'll be talking a little bit more about data as we move on. And then having regular maintenance in place for re-indexing optimizations that need to be performed. Oops. And then once this whole architecture is decided, you can now test and understand what limitations and bottlenecks there are in each of these components. So you really need to test it, push it to its limit, and understand where do the pieces fall over. So if your single artifact repository server that you have can support 1,000 concurrent artifact retrievals, but you're now scaling further and you're going to be increasing up to 1,500 concurrent artifact retrievals, you need to know what your next step is. Is it adding capacity to your existing artifact repository server? Is it adding an additional repo server? So having those plans in mind, understanding what your current limitations are, where those bottlenecks are, and what your plan is if you start reaching those limitations. So here is a sample architecture diagram. What you can see, I don't know if my mouse is showing up. Is it? Okay. So you have clustered orchestration servers in your main site. So site 1 is kind of your main site where the majority of your work is being done. And then with that, you have a set of agents, your file system space, which we're calling the workspace in our system, and your repository server, but you may be, distributing this across regions. So site 2 might be in Asia, and in this case, we have agents or targets in Asia as well, and the recommendation is to co-locate as much as you can in those remote locations as well. So having file system co-located to limit the data transfer over the WAN. Repository server in the same location for the same reason. And then with site 3, again, you're, the same thing, putting all those pieces together. Since we have artifact repository servers in each location, it may be necessary to put replication in place across those repository servers, putting some sort of policy in place that is only going to replicate those things that need to be used in your remote sites. And then beyond this is setting up a disaster recovery architecture as well. So in what I have here is our primary site and then also our DR site. So in this case, you're seeing pretty much the same architecture in each place, and we're just replicating one-way replication of your database mirroring from your primary site to your DR site, and then all of the file system data for disk replication of your repositories and file system data as required. So you're able to flip that switch, move over to your DR site if necessary. All right, so now you have your infrastructure set up. What is next? Let's look at the data that's going to be generated from your processes. What do you do with that? So each process is going to generate data. You might have metadata being created from the jobs that are running in your system, log files, and build and test data being generated in your file system, and monitors that are in place, artifacts being written to your artifact repository. So what you want to do is understand your growth rates and plan accordingly. So for each process, each application that is deployed, how much data is generated. So once you quantify that, you can start planning for growth. Okay, for this single application deployment, this is my footprint. When I get to 1,000 application deployments, what am I going to need? So you have the data of how much what is generated per process. You've already established what your scale is going to be, what your long-term needs are. So then you can easily estimate how much space you need in each of these different places. So the different areas to monitor and plan for are going to be your database, your file system, your artifact repository. So beyond that, it's really imperative to establish a data retention and archiving policy early on. So based on your business needs, you decide how many months or how many years of data you need to keep, and then put the right cleanup, the right archiving in place, so you have the data required for any auditing, but you're able to clean it up and not run out of space. And this, while it seems like very logical, I've seen it happen with customers where they don't think about it. So they're growing, things are going great, and then suddenly they call us because their system is down, no one is able to use it, they've run out of database disk space, they've run out of disk space for their log files, and then suddenly they're scampering to clean all of this up. And that's not a situation you want to be in. It's better to take that approach from the beginning, understand what your growth is, understand what your targets are, and then plan accordingly, put those retention policies in place, put the cleanup in place as needed. All right, so we have all of our infrastructure set. Let's start setting up and designing our pipelines. So these are some best practices I have for pipeline design scaling across your organization. So as you grow from hundreds to thousands of applications, it's not scalable to create a new application model or a pipeline for each new application that comes on board. So rather than having a custom solution like for each Snowflake application, abstract at a level, build a generic model that can be standardized across your applications. So this can be done with parameterization, with reusable components, and things like that. So exactly in line with that is modularizing your actions and processes that you're doing repeatably into those reusable components that can be used across your project, across your applications. So if you find that you're repeatedly performing an action like creating a snapshot of your application rather than writing this in each place and maintaining it, create a reusable process that can be called from each application or each pipeline. And then call it and make a library of these reusable things that are being used across your pipelines, across your projects, and make that available to all of them. So, and then in this same line is, you're growing, you're going up from 10 applications to 100 to 1,000. You want to make sure that process itself is streamlined. So automating the onboarding process of new projects. With our product, we have our domain-specific language, or DSL, which makes this really easy to automate the onboarding of new applications. And that's exactly what our team has been doing, or helping the large bank that I talked to you about implement, is a process for parameterizing this onboarding of a new application. There's a set of parameters that come in that define this application. It's fed into the DSL, and it automatically generates the pipeline. And we have a session from a few of my colleagues later, I'm not sure when it is, Wednesday, on just that, on that solution that they did. So I definitely recommend checking it out. Laurent, what is the time? Oh, the title? DSL at scale. He's going to be presenting. All right, and then this might not be something that comes to everyone's mind right away, is planning and defining access controls early, but I've found this bite numerous people, and it's something you want to think about early on in your development, is who is going to be coming into this, how does it need to be restricted, because in that way you can design your implementation in a much better way for applying the access controls. If you create a very complex solution and system and then try to retrofit in your access control model, it can make things really difficult. It can make things complicated. We've struggled with that with some customers, where you're then defining these roles and having to kind of try to plug things together in the right way. But if you come into it with these roles and these ideas in mind, then you can develop the different projects, the way your pipeline is set up in a way that fits that in a cleaner way. So definitely recommended to think about that early in the process. And then finally, just kind of a general, while you may start small, it's important to start planning ahead early. You want to be thinking about performance and scale at every step. While right now you might be doing a single application implementation where it runs in 2 minutes, the deployment time is great. Think about when you start adding multiple applications to that. When you're at 10, is it still going to run in 2 minutes? When you're at 50, is it still going to run in 2 minutes? So thinking about how you're writing your code, how you're parallelizing things to make sure that as you scale, are you still going to fit all of those success criteria that you put in place. So thinking about it early, you might get success with your first application, but once you start to scale, you're going to see that this is not going to work. So we're doing good. We have our infrastructure, we're monitoring our data, we have our pipeline. What is next? Now you want to make sure that you're monitoring. You're making sure that you're continuing to meet your criteria, you're understanding your growth patterns. So, your pipeline is the center of your software delivery. It's driving your entire software delivery process. So it is a very large and mission critical component to what is happening. So you want to have easy access and clear understanding to what is happening in your system at all times, so you can foresee any issues through the data that you're getting. So by monitoring key metrics, in your process and in your underlying infrastructure, you can understand patterns, you can see the peaks, you can see the valleys, how does everything perform throughout my deployment processes. And then based on trends and growth that you're tracking, throughout, you can foresee upcoming peaks in usage. And then you can plan well ahead of time for those peaks. So you have all of the data you need. You know that I'm growing, I'm going to start hitting these peaks, I'm going to start hitting higher volumes than I have in the past. What are my bottlenecks in my infrastructure? What do I need to increase? All of this ties back together. So it's important to have one pane of glass where you have that single dashboard of centralized for monitoring all of the activities across your tools and activities. So your shared data is being read from all of your different tools. So aside from that one pane of glass, some of the other best practices, monitoring should be unobtrusive. It should not be affecting any of your processes that are happening. You shouldn't, be adding load through this. It shouldn't be affecting deployments that are happening. It should be automated for sure. Automation is what we love. So we want everything to be automated, repeatable, happening behind the scenes. You don't want to worry about it. Not only in production, start monitoring things in lower lanes so that you can foresee and detect problems early before you get to production. And then, as I mentioned before, having that one pane of glass across all of your environments, across all of the tools that you're using, so you can have that one dashboard where you can get a sense of what's happening. Oh, what did I have? One more thing? Yes, and then one more thing I wanted to mention, is you have the monitors in place, and then you can actually feed these things back into your platform to trigger notifications, to trigger events. Earlier today, we had a session about monitors and these things triggering data back into chat ops to alert people. So these are the kinds of things that you can set up, make sure, have your monitors trigger events and notifications to act upon. So here's this is kind of a simple dashboard of some of the monitors that we support using StatsD and Graphite to pick out those key metrics from your system. But these are just a few samples. You choose the metrics that make sense for your system, whether it's the API calls, whether it's the CPU, or the deployments happening concurrently. All of those things should be in one place for you to have that visibility. As I said before, your pipeline is driving your software delivery, so making sure that it is scalable, it's robust, it's ready for the scale that you're working towards is very important. So that is all that I have. Do we have any questions in the audience? Quiet crowd. All right, well, yeah.
Actually, I have a question. So you mentioned before kind of understanding and accounting for things, specifically managing data. So,
yeah.
What are, and I think you mentioned it earlier in the presentation as well. So oftentimes I've seen with my organization that can be really difficult. So, hindsight is 20/20, but sometimes in regards to data or performance or things like that, as our systems scale, it would have been nice to know those things or think about those things ahead of time, but sometimes we have problems with it. So what kind of things would you suggest to kind of encourage that?
Yeah, sure, and I can understand, and I've seen that situation multiple times. The question is around how can you encourage people to start thinking about managing data early on. It's really about maybe making the impact of what could happen very clear to the users. I think downtime is something that scares people. Starting those conversations early is really important, but I understand that it can be hard to get people thinking about it or putting the importance on it early enough. But really, driving in that this is going to affect you in the long term. It's right now you might have success, but it's a month or 6 months down the road, once we have that success and we grow, we have to make sure it's sustainable. Otherwise, it's not going to work, right? Sure. Yeah.
In the monitoring stuff, you mentioned also non-production environment.
Yeah.
You have interactive capabilities within your product for non-production, monitoring, action reactions for things that are happening in the environment?
So we don't, in our product, we can integrate with the tools that you're using for monitoring for sure, and then we can respond or perform actions based on the results, but we don't have anything integrated to perform that monitoring in our product itself. Yeah, one more question in the back.
So you talked a little bit about making sure the onboarding process is super smooth. We all know how there's a lot of friction.
Yeah.
Onboarding people in new scenarios like this, what are some of the common areas of friction that you run into?
People are happy with their tools or their processes and they don't want to move off of them is a common one. So, if things are being mandated from above, not everyone is happy about it. If it's organization-wide, I think that's probably a common one. And I think a way to combat that is just showing value quickly, right? Being able to not making it a difficult process, and by doing that automated onboarding, making it very simple at put in this information about your application, and then it's in the system, it's ready to go. That will quickly bring someone from not sure to really seeing what's happening with their application and the product, and that's. I think that can eliminate some of that friction, or at least some of that hesitation to see what's going on, because by making the process difficult in itself, it's not going to help. It's just going to make people more stubborn or more hesitant to come onto a new technology. So are we out of time? Yeah. All right. Well, thank you, everyone.